I also run the MA for Art and Ecology, and it's wonderful to see some of our new students here today as well. So you're not just PGCE students or teachers, we've also got some artists who are dedicating their careers to engaging with ecology in different ways. So we wanted to just start with me giving a quick talk about how, as Helen said, art and ecology have actually been entangled even for centuries before the scientific discipline of ecology emerged in the late 19th century. And so I want to talk about different examples of the way in which ecology has been shaped by visual culture, and how ecological ideas also infuse the things that artists do. And I just want to say also to everyone who's training to be a teacher, thank you. What you do is such an important, integral role. And when I think about how the knowledge of the natural world has been slipping away from young people's lives, I think it's never been more important to think of creative ways in which to expand their ecological knowledge. And I was talking with Helen before this talk, and I was asking her, how does the British Ecological Society define ecology? Because on the MA Art and Ecology, we define ecology in very plural ways. We understand it as cultural, that it's situated, and so on. And so the scientific discipline of ecology might be one or even several cultures, right? Amongst many other ecological cultures that include indigenous cosmologies, that include medicinal folk practices, and so on. Like the list goes on and on. So there's ways in which we hold ecological knowledge in our bodies and through our cultures that we might not even think of immediately as ecological. And I was interested that what Helen found out the definition that the British Ecological Society uses, and it's every living thing in every environment everywhere. That is just brilliant, because it really gives a sense of the scope and the complexity of ecological relationships. And we talk a lot about relationships and relationality, and about how knowledge is situated on the MA Art and Ecology. And we usually spend 16 weeks doing a really detailed lecture seminar series just on that. And I'm going to try and say a little bit about that in about 15 minutes. So it's going to be super condensed, and I'm just going to be highlighting a few things. Maybe it's just reference points that you might want to follow up on, or that might give you some ideas for a lesson or something like that. So it's going to be very partial. But I think that this going back to this kind of context that we're in of extinction cascades, but pervasive pollution, habitat destruction, climate change, we've got this whole set of really complex problems that can seem quite overwhelming. And I remember when I was doing my art GCSE, the importance of the art classroom as a sanctuary, right? As a place where you could come and be creative and feel safe. And it didn't matter if you were academic or sporty, or if you were popular, or if you were a loner. The art class for me, when I was doing my GCSE art, felt like a place where I could come and be myself through creativity. And I think combining that with attention to the natural world, with the way in which creators of all kinds and of all ages use their artistic practice to draw attention to certain things, make decisions, imbue representations with and forms of making, whether it's representational or not, with affect and feeling. That's absolutely critical. I think that's something that scientists now are really recognizing, and it's why there's been a proliferation of artistic residencies with scientific and ecological organizations, because they realize they need artists, right? We need artists for their creativity and for their storytelling capacity. So I'm going to start off with an artist who, so I'm going to do a bit of art history, but also connect it to contemporary artists. And I'm going to start off with an artist who was working right at the beginning of what's sometimes referred to as the Enlightenment, right? Also the beginnings of the kind of global expansion of capitalism and colonialism across many parts of the world. And that is the Dutch artist Maria Sibylla Merian. And she has been dubbed the first ecological artist by the biologist, painter, and art historian Kay Etheridge, who was an expert on Merian's work. And I just want to start with this because I think it's interesting that Miriam was, she didn't have a scientific background. At that point, there wasn't such a discipline as ecology, and science tended to be done by, a lot of scientific knowledge was actually generated by, elite amateurs, right? Very different context. And she trained as a printmaker within a family of artisans. So she didn't have a very high level of education, but she came to have a huge impact on the knowledge of insects and amphibians because of her strengths in observation, right? So she actually generated a lot of new knowledge that was new to Western science about species. And some of the sort of aesthetic decisions she made that were so important and so novel at the time was she, within a single image, she would represent whole life cycles of insects. So here you see butterflies, but you also see chrysalids and caterpillars and so on. And you also see the foods that they depended on, so the plants. So you're seeing these ecological relationships and this condensation of time into an image. And she was she did these prints of very detailed pictures of, for example, this toad. She was the one who identified that the toad carries its eggs on its back, and the baby toads kind of are looked after by the parent toad. So at that time, previous to this, it was thought that things like amphibians and snakes and snails and insects sprung spontaneously from the undergrowth. So this was an idea that Aristotle proposed, and it was still pervasive at that time. So she really was generating new ecological knowledge. And actually there was a whole genre of painting that was very popular, still life painting. It's rather a dark image. They tended to be quite dark images. These Sofa Bosco paintings of the undergrowth, where you'd see these sort of butterflies and insects sort of in these very dark and sort of rather murky images. And just to give a sense of her novelty as well, this is just a sort of detail from a very important work at that time by Carl Linnaeus. So who's heard of Carl Linnaeus here? Maybe some of you have. Yeah, Carl Linnaeus was the person who set up the system of classification of two Latin names, right? A family name and a variety name. And he had this form of visual representation that was a bit like a dissection table, where plants would be separated out into different sort of body parts, if you like. And this was, at that time, these kinds of systems of classification and forms of image making were part of economic botany. So they were really kind of contributing to the colonial extraction of value from plants and people and so on, but also this idea of a hierarchy. And in Miriam's images, you see this incredible kind of detail about the animals that she was observing and also the plants. So these species of ants that create these living bridges across from one branch to another. And they're also very picturesque and dramatic. So here you have this hummingbird being eaten by a tarantula spider. Actually, this is not accurate, right? This is a bit of kind of artistic flourish, but it did lead to a bit of a misunderstanding about tarantulas. They don't actually eat hummingbirds. So she wasn't always right, but she kind of allowed herself a bit of artistic flourish. And some people think that the reason why tarantulas are thought to eat hummingbirds is because of this image. But I think it's very important when we talk about historical figures, and particularly when I think about the way in which institutions like, for instance, Kew and others sometimes cast these, white women in positions of privilege at that time as kind of heroines, right? And it's very tempting to do that. But this was, of course, the time of colonialism and capitalism. It was the time of the beginning of the plantation system and slavery, right? And so although Miriam herself didn't own slaves, she benefited from that system. And in her text, she talks about how enslaved people and indigenous people who she came into contact with brought her some of her specimens. She was unusual in acknowledging that. But nevertheless, there's a way in which science has tended to erase these, how knowledge gets produced and erase the kind of power relations. And one of our jobs as teachers, in a way, is also paying attention to those kinds of dynamics. And so I'm going to jump a bit between contemporary and historical examples. And just continue with this thought about the different kinds of who is a holder of ecological knowledge, right? So this is an artist called Annalie Davis, who's based in Barbados, and she works on a piece of land that was once a plantation, and she's very interested in weeds, right? Because obviously a lot of former plantations, the soil is completely exhausted from monocrops having been grown there over long periods of time. And they're also traumatic places. They hold traumatic histories. And so a lot of Annalie Davis's work is investigating those histories, but also looking to plants for their medicinal properties, for their capacity as healers, both repairing the earth and repairing bodies. So in many of her performances, she provides tea, sort of medicinal teas that are made from plants that are often classed as weeds. And here you've got these extraordinary paintings that are addressing the sort of the racialized and class hierarchies of the colonialism and the plantation systems. And these works they're really big, but they're painted on accountancy ledgers, right? So she's taking the paper from the sort of system of economic botany and doing these drawings of roots and plants that spread right across the page. And if you think about how the botanical drawings we were looking at before are very much contained within the frame, these are stretching out a sort of, in a way, a visual recuperation that's sort of pushing back against that legacy. So I want to talk a little bit about how diagramming and image making helps us to understand scientific ideas, but also how they end up being sort of world shaping as well. So right in the middle of this image is a detail from one of Charles Darwin's notebooks when he was coming up with the theory of evolution. And what this is the first diagram he drew of a tree structure to describe how evolution works through time. And what I love about this is above it, he's written, "I think." And this seems to me to be a really beautiful example of how we visualize ideas, right? And how they transform the world, in fact. And of course, the theory of evolution was a huge challenge to the Victorian society in which Darwin was. And this cartoon, I think, that was done at the time shows how that it prompted like huge questions about human identity and how humans relate to other species, right? And also the different sort of time spans of humans. But this idea of a tree, the way that it developed in some kinds of evolutionary theory, ended up sort of reinforcing ideas about hierarchy, social hierarchy, and the survival of the fittest, which was a metaphor that Darwin took from his time of imperial industry, kind of got solidified into forms of science. And this idea of the tree is still, this image of the tree is still pervasive in science textbooks, right? It's still a useful kind of way of understanding relationships. But interestingly, some other evolutionary scientists have come up with much more complex diagrams of trees to explain the concept of symbiosis, which is a concept in ecology whereby which looks at the interdependence of different living entities and how they transform one another and are codependent on each other. So the image of a tree is also something that artists have played with to question knowledge systems, like this work by Mark Dion, which is also about kind of, in a way, investigating in a humorous way the systems of knowledge and museological display. So I'm really racing through, so I'm trying not to go too fast. And some artists have also made visual representations to celebrate scientific ideas. So this work is a homage to Lynn Margulis. So I don't know if any of you have heard of Lynn Margulis. Okay, so Lynn Margulis is super important. She is a really important evolutionary biologist who developed a lot of the theory of symbiosis. And that is a kind of body of theorization that kind of recognizes that forms of mutuality are everywhere in evolution and everywhere within us as well. So within our own human bodies, there are more cells that are not human than cells that are human, because of all the bacteria and the viruses and parasites and so on that actually we depend upon as well. So sticking with form for a little bit longer, Gemma Anderson is a contemporary artist who also has a scientific background, and she has developed a lot of thinking around how drawing is a form of thought and how drawing can kind of convey and work with and against scientific ideas. And in this series of images, which is called isomorphology, whereas Linnaeus took forms and sort of used them to separate out and categorize living forms, here she's looking at the visual similarities between insects and plants and other living entities. So it's a really intriguing thing. She sees this as an artistic project rather than a scientific one, but it also throws up these questions about how things are categorized. Okay, so just to finish off, I wanted to talk about contemporary artists who are engaging with sort of traditions of natural history representation, but also are making very active interventions into the sort of both the work of ecological recovery and also in a way kind of processing the feelings that come up in this time of eco-anxiety. And there are questions here also about, who belongs in the natural landscape, right? And so one of the things that the COVID lockdown threw up was like, lots and lots of people don't have much access to green spaces, and it's really beneficial for health and well-being. And, it's really also great to see what the British Ecological Society is doing with its support networks that are also encouraging a much wider range of people into the discipline of ecology. So Zachary Logan is a really interesting queer artist who does a lot of self-portraits, and he often presents himself almost in a way that his body is almost scarcely visible, sort of surrounded by floral motifs, by insects and so on, where he's almost like relinquishing himself into the natural environment. And so I understand these works as in a way a sort of refiguring of masculinity, and they refer to fairy tale and myth and so on, and all of those things come into how we understand our relationship with the natural world, right? What are the stories that we're telling about us, telling about ourselves and our relationship with other living beings? On this side is some images of work by a really extraordinary Finnish artist called Lotta Petronella. And Lotta is one of the founders of Contemporary Art Archipelago, which is based in the Baltic Sea, on an island of Sealy, which is also a scientific research centre. And actually, the scientists on Sealy invited Lotta and her collaborator, her co-director, onto the island because they felt like the really important climate science that they were doing on the island had failed in its communication to a wider public. They were feeling desperate after decades of working there. And Lotta's work is about kind of practices of lament. So thinking about the sort of cascades of extinction, thinking also about the sort of trauma that's held within land. So this island was once a psychiatric hospital / prison for women, right? So it holds a lot of kind of trauma. And so Lotta devises rituals and performances to kind of process some of that grief. So she's thinking about forms of ecological grief, but also forms of social grief, and how coming together in song, in ritual, might be really important. And then I just want to finish off with another artist who is incredibly active in the sort of practical work of ecological recovery. So Suzanne Husky is an artist who is based between California and France, and she's been incredibly active within forms of ecological work that are sometimes referred to as rewilding, where you reintroduce certain species who are missing from the landscape. So beavers are one of those things. So some of you may know that we've got beavers back in this country after 400 years of extinction, and they're doing really good work to prevent flooding and restore biodiversity and so on. And what Suzanne does is she's looking at the idea of alliance between species, right? So a kind of what she calls an alter politics. Alter is in French, but alter political alliances with the beaver people, right? And this is actually a huge long work that's kind of a timeline, but it's also a depiction of the kinds of the histories of beavers and humans, their place in indigenous cosmologies, but also the possibilities for their return and how that makes for more complex landscapes that we're starting to see even in London. I don't know how many of you knew that we have beavers in London now. Yeah, in Ealing. You can go and visit. It's absolutely amazing. And already they've only been there a couple of years, and they're already preventing the local tube station from getting flooded every winter. So it's kind of incredible. So I think what I want to finish off with is, it's not just about how artists show or illustrate ecological phenomena and concepts. So of course that's important, but it's also about the way that artists and art making can enable us to sense and feel ecological relations and entanglements, whether they're beneficial or painful, right? Or, and let's not romanticize ecology. It's like a lot of ecology is predator-prey relationships, right? But it's also about having the capacity to nurture the feeling of belonging to nature rather than being separate from it. And I think that it's in that way that as art teachers, as artists, we can be active participants in ecological recovery.